This is the Almost Awakened podcast, a no-nonsense approach to spirituality with your hosts, Brittany Hartley and Bill Reel. Here we dive deep into the wisdom traditions while acknowledging insightful breakthroughs in science, psychology, and human development. Our goal is to explore the good life and the very best of spirituality, no nonsense required. Check us out at almostawaken.org, where you can check out past episodes, make a donation, email us a question or comment, or find out more about the resources we shared. And now, today's podcast episode.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Almost Awakened podcast. Today, I am your solo host, Britt Hartley. We wish Bill well in California. He's got a lot of good stuff going with his family, and so he's out traveling, and we wish him well, and I miss him. Not only is he just a great companion for all of my rambling thoughts on this, he does all the tech in the background, and he really does everything for the podcast to make it run smoothly. So I'm going to do the best that I can in his absence. And I have a plane flying over me right now. But I'm glad to be with you here today, because today we are going to be talking about, I just have like a little thought for you today, as little as I can. I'm kind of a wordy person. But I have a little thought on the God word, which was just kind of like a paralyzing thought for me for a long time. And it keeps coming up in with my clients on what to do with the God word. And this pressure that you need to kind of fill that hole of, you used to feel like you knew what God was, and then maybe now you don't, and wanting to kind of fill that gap. And so I've struggled with, how to use the God word appropriately. I wanted to find a way to be able to meet this word or like explain what this word meant to me. And I'm a spiritual director, so I talk to people a lot about God, and I also get asked about it a lot. And so I know there's pressure for a lot of people who are deconstructing or rethinking their beliefs to feel like they have to answer the question of what is God as if it's something that you should know. And I counsel a lot of clients on how to rethink spirituality without having to know that first, because it's a trap that I fell into when I was younger. And it's almost like, your spiritual home, which is an analogy that I use a lot on this podcast. If your spiritual home has crashed, the scaffolding is still there. And so it can be one of the first things that you want to figure out, but fundamentally we can't. And then I also do this a lot with parents, because parents, especially in a mixed faith marriage, will feel like my partner has some beliefs and things that they know about God, and I have nothing to contribute because I don't know how to make sense of this word anymore. And so there's a lot of things that I do with clients in that space too, on how to reframe it and how to do maybe spirituality in the unknown. Because there's just too much mystery in the universe and consciousness and too much subjectivity to even figure it out. I went and got a master's degree in a theological program, and I still, a lot of times don't know what I think about God, but I'm not stuck there like I used to. And so I wanted to share some of my thoughts in case this, applied to you. Do you feel a little anxiety when that word comes up in dinner conversations or whatnot? So what I did that helped me, is that a year ago I took up beekeeping, and I did it not really thinking like I'm going to solve the God question with my bees. I did it because I'm a really heady person, and I wanted to have something a little bit more where I use my body and I connect to the earth and seasons. And I didn't really have that in my spirituality at all. And I felt like I'd gotten to a place where I kind of craved something like that. And I'd always been fascinated by bees because they're this super organism. And my husband surprised me one year, and he got me a flow hive, which I really recommend because it's very easy for beginner beekeeping. Anyway. But I instinctually knew that like my question about God wasn't going to be found by like reading another book. Like I had read so many books on people's conceptions of God, and kind of like a koan, like my mind was all twisted up into riddles about the word God. And so I ended up finding my way around that by working with my bees. And my bees ended up teaching me a lot about God, and they helped me to develop an analogy that has given me a lot of peace regarding the word. And I really encourage everyone else to have their own analogy when it comes to the God word. So let me nerd out for a second about my bees. What's so amazing about my bees is that they only live for 45 days. They contribute less than a quarter teaspoon. It's less than a teaspoon. It's about a quarter teaspoon of honey in their lifetime. And yet the hive extends for miles and miles in all direction, right? The hive has a huge effect on the ecosystem around it, right? We need bees for the entire ecosystem. And then honey can last for thousands of years. We still find honey in ancient Egypt. And so the bee, in comparison, is nothing. It's just this glimpse, this little blink of life, this tiny little thing, right? But the hive, in comparison, it's almost eternal in comparison. A hive can live on for decades and decades as the female workers make new queens. And one tiny bee does not know all of the invisible strings that a hive has, right? One bee does not know that, I took a jar of honey to my friend with allergies and she spread it on a piece of toast, or that it helped the apples in this orchard over here to be able to grow. A tiny bee doesn't understand all that, but the hive really does connect to so much bigger of a world than one bee can understand. So I think you see where I'm going with this. So in the analogy, I am a bee. If I were to be completely by myself, what could I do? Like, what is the purpose of a bee? What is the purpose of life for a bee if it's by itself? Like, what could you do with 6 bees? And the answer is like nothing really, right? What is the moral code of one bee? Like, what should you do if you're one bee? And the answer is kind of absurd, like nothing, right? But God is kind of the hive, right? It's the thing that we're all a part of and that is bigger than any of us individually. And so like the beauty and connection across time and space that is accomplished by the hive is not understood by any one bee. And yet it's very real, right? I'm not going into the supernatural for this analogy. Like what the hive does and everything that it touches and everything that touches is very expansive. And so what we call revelation or God really may just be movements on this spider web, right? This web of life with so many strands connecting to us that it's almost shocking that we could think that we're alone, right? So because of this interconnectivity, that's what gives us our morality. Without it, morality may not really exist. The universe may ultimately not care what you do. I don't know for sure. But when you are so deeply connected with everything else, the past, the present, the future, everyone around you, that's when what you do really does begin to matter because you're part of the hive. And the hive spreads so far and affects so much more than any one bee can understand. And right. And that's just a beehive. So think of how big and meaningful and expansive that hive is for a human life. That's much longer than 45 days, right? So even if it's true that this earth will eventually die because our sun will die out, or, we're going to fight over what is God and we're going to blow each other up, or even if the universe doesn't care what you do and what you eat and how you dress and how you have sex and all those morality questions that religion answers, even if that were true, you still get morality because you're part of a hive, right? And so I meet with clients who often say, why does it matter if it's all meaningless? Why does it matter if I can't know that there's God and maybe there's not God, then it's meaningless. And I think the way that we deal with this is by considering suffering. Like suffering matters. Even if we know nothing, we know that suffering is bad. All you have to do is watch a child on a documentary being abused, or maybe this story in your life somewhere, being abused, to know that suffering is bad. And we all know that we want to move away from suffering towards something better, and that we are all interconnected like bees to the hive. And so if that's true, even without an ultimate universe meaning and purpose, which is what religions often sell, even if that were not the case, every action we do still has meaning. Everything we do affects everything else. And everything we do moves the earth a little bit closer to hell or a little bit closer to heaven, not in an abstract way, but in a real life way. So the same way that every bee matters to the hive, but one bee in the wilderness by itself maybe wouldn't matter in the same way. It's our connection to each other and the story of humanity that creates meaning and morality. And that collective some call God. And so another way that people use the word God is vision. And there's so many things that humans imagine, right? So when I was watching the last Women's World Cup, they asked Carly Lloyd how she scored 3 goals. And she said, easy, I imagine scoring 4. And of course she would. If you know her personality, she's very like that, right? And millions of people have thought something in their imagination and brought that thing to life. So in that way, is the thing that she imagined real? Well, kind of. Like, it's something that becomes very real. Without the vision, it wouldn't have been real. And myths are this way too. Like, Santa Claus isn't real, but in some ways he is, right? He's on a lot of stuff. Some kids are thinking about him right now. When I said that name, you thought of the thing that I was thinking, even though we can't point to it as a thing that's real. When I'm helping people deconstruct and reconstruct religion, or imagining a better world, where we learn to thrive without religious wars or putting things off to the next life, we're envisioning a kind of heaven that doesn't exist yet, that we're shooting towards, and away from a hell of religious fundamentalism where we blow up the planet and the only life in the universe that we know about, right? And so the reason that I bring up vision is because what is real to me about the God word is that it's a vision of your highest values. It's the thing that you work towards above all else. It's the thing that you imagine as perfection or justice or connection or love or goodness or transcendence. And so even if you don't believe in a supernatural God, or you believe in a higher power, but you don't have words for it, it's a kind of vision. And when you work towards that vision, it makes that vision real in some ways. Just like imagining scoring goals before a World Cup. When someone says to me, my God is love, or God is love, that God may or may not exist in a objective sense, but subjectively, that person believing or making that word mean love, and driving towards that creates more love in the world. And I think that's a place where we can unite in our common humanity. We all have our highest values and our goods that we can imagine, and we can all work to imagine a better world than what it is and worse than what it is. And this exists in our imagination, but it also affects our reality. We have always called our vision for humanity across the years God. And if someone's using that definition, like, I'm working towards this, or some people say I'm working towards becoming like God, which is the religious tradition I come from, that would be something that people would say. I understand that vision and how it affects your actions is very real, even if it may not be ultimately real. We've always called our vision for humanity God. That's wrapped up into that word. And we can do that without even doing the supernatural, right? Anytime that you're imagining a better world, you're kind of imagining heaven. And that's where we can start to get on the same team rather than fighting about whose heaven is right? Whose heaven is ultimately real. It just never goes anywhere, those conversations, right? So this analogy really works also for my idea of the soul, right? So I spent some time with like neurotheology, which is really interesting. Like, how does the brain and what is the brain doing in terms of theology and in our concepts of God and spirituality? But last winter, when I was watching over my hive and I checked on it, the bees kind of huddle around the queen, right? And so in summertime, it looks and it feels like a soul in winter. And souls in winter, if you're in the winter of your soul, you shrink down to protect what is most precious, right? And souls in summer are expansive and blooming and widespread, but souls in winter collapse to the most important element, the queen, the life giver. And in times of the soul's winter, I can do what nature does, right? I shrink down to the most important part of me. When my daughter fell out of a window this summer, it was a winter of my soul. It was a really dark room, and we sat with her, and there was nothing else on my agenda. And there was, some pain and suffering, and you just shrink down to what was most important, which was, my family, right? The part of me that isn't ego, but life itself. And then in religion, God also connects us to the past through genealogy, right? So to the present. So there's genealogy and there's a history, and then there's relationships in the present in its most ideal form, and then a future in kind of a united transcendent goal of Zion or heaven. And so what my hive analogy does is it gives me all of that connection and vision and analogy of the soul and all of that without the dogma, without an insane story. So I'm connected to my ancestors in my very body. And when I listen, there's wisdom stored there. And I connect to so many others that my actions have meaning and value and purpose to the hive, this super organism that I'm a part of. And I can participate in the imaginative collective future, even though I don't believe in an afterlife. And so all of the elements are still there. I have left Mormonism at this point, but I still have that connection to my ancestry. I still have a belief that my actions have meaning and value and purpose because I have this kind of analogy that makes sense to me. And I'm still working with others towards a future that doesn't exist, right? And so those elements are still there, even though I just don't feel comfortable with the story that gets you there. I want to get around the story because the story causes a lot of pain because we just don't know, right? We just don't know. And then if you feel like you have to know, like me, if you're a truth seeker and you want to know, you just get stuck there. You just get stuck there for years and years. And so by letting that go and getting around that, I was able to not only make peace with the God word, but move forward in my own spirituality. And so this exercise has taught me that everyone kind of needs a higher power in a way, something bigger than themselves. And some may lean into the supernatural, and some may be like me, may be wary of it. But it's an exercise that has helped me find language for this web of life that is bigger than me, that people have called God throughout centuries. And then I can meet that word, with clients or with people and find, some common ground, whether instead of just being they're a believer and I'm not a believer, and then the conversation stops, which is unfortunate for everyone, especially if you really care about that person. So if God is our collective humanity and our vision for humanity and our meaning and our highest values, maybe we all do need something like God, but we call it by different words because obviously that word is very, has a lot of baggage around it. And so you can kind of create that God, but it doesn't have to be a douchey one, right? You can make your own analogy, your own understanding, your own vision of what a better world looks like, or what values drive you towards your best self. For me, I made peace with the God word through my bees. So I tend not to use that word when describing my own spirituality because that word for most people means like Santa Claus in the sky, and I just don't want to support that vision. But if someone walks into a place and says, I feel God here, and it's like a subjective feeling that they're sharing with me, I can meet that. I know what that means. I know what that feels like, right? I may call it awe, or I may call it reverence, or I may call it transcendence, but I don't have to, cut down that person and say, oh, but then does God exist? And how do you know that God exists? And blah, 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 blah. When you're talking about it subjectively, I can meet that. I understand what that feels like. And when someone says, I want to be more like God, or I want to be better, I know what that means. What they have as their God is something that is not achieved yet that they're working towards. I know what that means. I can relate to that. I know what it means to envision something and work towards it. We all do that. When someone says God compels me to do the right thing, I understand that morality only makes sense with the collective community of all of us, which is something bigger than myself. Morality would be, if I was living on an island alone, morality really changes, right? None of my actions affect anything else. And so when someone says God is love, I know that what they mean by that is that love is their highest value. And that allows me to connect with other people, even if I'm the only one at the table who rejects the supernatural. And so I learned all of this from my bees. And so my challenge to you is like, how do you make sense of the God word? How do you get the benefits? Because there are benefits here. There are tools here. How do you get the benefits of the vision that you're working towards? We had one of our guests, Jared Anderson. He just created his own pantheon of gods, of like his highest values. And he like goes into meditative spaces and like has conversations with them. Logically, he knows he like made this up, right? And that it's not real. But it becomes real in this kind of imaginative space that he's working towards, and it affects his life, right? Which is really interesting. So how do you get the benefits of vision? How do you get the benefits of morality and really believing that even if no one is watching, my action right now affects everything else, affects things that I couldn't even understand, that we really don't ever get away with anything, which is one of my favorite things that Jordan Peterson says, that of all the clients he's ever seen, nobody ever gets away with anything, right? Because we're just too interconnected for our actions to not matter. So how do you get the benefits of vision and morality and meaning while also rejecting the temptation of fundamentalism, with rejecting the temptation of this has to be God in order for me to get all those tools? Can we maybe get around that and use the tools in a creative way and an exploratory way, and not ever fully knowing what God may or may not be? Can we integrate those tools in our lives anyway? Which is how I got unstuck, because my first thought coming out of Mormonism was like, well, if I just figure out what God is, then I'll know how to like pattern my life. And then that was like 15 years of study and I got nowhere, right? And I just like, I learned a lot of things and I share these things on the podcast or whatever, but I wasn't spiritually growing like I could, because I was truly stuck. I felt like I didn't know how to act until I answered the God question. And I see a lot of people like me who get stuck in that space. And so I guess my encouragement here is to find a way to make peace with that word without having to know what is ultimately real. Because if your plan for moving forward in your life is, I need to know what ultimate reality is first, I thought that too, and I got caught in that trap. And it's a trap, because we're just too biased and it's too mysterious, and we just don't know enough to be able to pattern life like that. So my encouragement is to get the tools anyway. Go around the story of having to know what is ultimately real when it comes to God, and get the tools that the idea of God has always given humanity, which is the vision and the morality and the meaning, and the collectivity and the connection and all of that, right? Okay, that is most of my thoughts on the God word. And I learned this all from my bees, and I love my bees. I might go out and do some beekeeping right now because I'm feeling very fond of them. So that's a question that humanity faces, is what is God? And I hope those thoughts were helpful. So next week, this is just a short podcast today, but next week we're going to have on the podcast Nick Jenkel, the author of Spiritual Atheism. So huge guest for us. He does TED Talks. People pay him to like come into their company, and he's coming onto the podcast, which is going to be freaking amazing. The week after, we have Andrew Newman, who created a program called Conscious Stories, which is for kids, a way to mindfully kind of end their day. And he's got a whole journey. And especially if you're battling with the question of what do I do with my kids, he's going to really help us with that. The week after, Bill and I are going to tackle how to have hard conversations. And then something I'm really looking forward to the week after is we're going to have our own Festival of Dangerous Ideas, which is going to be super, super fun. We're just going to take all of the most dangerous ideas and, with no answers, at least be able to talk about them. So I honestly think that this is the best place on the internet for modern spirituality. Please share this podcast with friends and donate and subscribe. And if Bill and I are a voice that you appreciate in the world, please support us so that we can get our voices out there to help more people do spirituality better. And so I hope my thoughts today on God are helpful for you. If you want to talk about this more with me, I am now taking clients on Thursdays. So if you want to schedule a spiritual direction session, you can do that at my website at nononsensespirituality.com. And just thank you everyone for watching, and we'll see you next time when Bill comes back, and have a great day.
This has been another Almost Awakened episode. Check us out at almostawakened.org, where you can check out past episodes, make a donation to keep this podcast running, email us a question or comment, or find out more about the resources shared in today's episode. For coaching opportunities or extra support, visit nononsensespirituality.com to meet with Certified Spiritual Director Brittany Hartley.